Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Eden of Light Cycle Astrology. Today I'm doing Mantic Monday episode 55, and we're going to do horoscopes for all 12 rising signs for the Mars opposition to Pluto aspect that is perfecting at the very tail end of this week. Last week we took a look at some themes or narratives that may accompany such an aspect as it began to form in the sky, but will peak this week in intensity, and eventually Mars will move into the sign of Leo by the following Monday, and that will break up the opposition. And then this is all going to be followed by a period where Mars is in Leo for a little while, a couple of weeks, before turning retrograde and then eventually going back into the sign of Cancer. So while we do get a repeat of some of the Mars and Cancer themes, there are going to be two more Mars opposed Pluto aspects that form in the sky in 2025, but they will happen across the Leo Aquarius axis, which is really interesting. Pluto will move into the sign of Aquarius, where it will remain for the next 20 years solidly, and Mars will engage Pluto by opposition as it moves out of its retrograde process and back into direct motion and engages Pluto by opposition two more times from the sign of Leo. So this is a very interesting and deep transformative period where we get some of these aspects that form. And this particular one that is happening, that began last week and is perfecting and intensifying this week, this particular Mars opposition to Pluto is almost kind of carries the weight of really having a breakaway feeling where something could break or snap or be released. And it has that weighty feeling of saying, hey, this is it for Pluto in the sign of Capricorn. This is the last thing that we're going to really get before Pluto moves out of that sign. And you get the sense that there is some kind of process that needs to go through, kind of a transformation and a reworking, but that the process may begin, in fact, with some kind of pretty potent or powerful snap or break, if you will. And I think that that's what we see this week. So, and I don't think that we have to approach this from an apprehensive or even a negative standpoint. Oftentimes, transformation or breaks and things can be stressful and challenging, but they can, of course, lead to some really good things. And I think that this is the case for this particular opposition. While transformation and breaks from something that we're used to can really be difficult and stressful on the way out, we do notice this week that there are a number of pretty beneficial and positive aspects. The benefics move into an opposition as this Mars-Pluto aspect perfects. And as the moon, which is the host of Mars in Cancer, works its way through the dark lunar phase and eventually makes a new moon right just prior to the perfection of the Mars opposition to Pluto, you get the sense that there is kind of hope or optimism alongside of things that are beginning. So what we're going to do today is, when we go through horoscopes, we're going to take a look at the houses that Mars and Pluto form the opposition aspect, that axis of signs that those two planets are in our birth charts based on our rising sign. But we're also going to take a look at where the new moon forms in our birth charts based on our rising sign, which will give us some sense that the moon is playing host to Mars, perfecting this aspect to Pluto. It's bringing in the signature of things that may beginning or emerging. There are all kinds of astrology that are sort of reiterating the same theme of there's new beginnings, there are things that are emerging, there are messages that are coming through. And while it may be there may be challenges or difficulty or stresses or even misfortunes that come along with the transformation, the fact that there are some pretty potent iterations of benefic things coming together, receptions in the sky with the moon moving through this process on its way to becoming a new moon in Scorpio. All of these things for me suggest that there is kind of a cauldron around hope and optimism that comes in the midst of potent change that will probably be challenging for most of us as we experience it, but which may lead to things that are incredibly transformative and around new things. So we'll take a look at the new moon's formation in the sign that it happens in, alongside of the signs that Mars and Pluto are perfecting in, as it relates to the house topics that all of this is happening in. So we'll pull up the chart here, and we'll bring in here the wheel so we can see where this is happening. Now, before we get into it, though, if you are new to the channel, please subscribe. You can always leave comments in the comment section if you guys want to tell me your stories. Just leave me the rising sign, and that really helps me. It helps the channel to grow, and it's always great to get those. You can always find me at lightcycleastrology.com if you're interested in getting a personalized reading from me as well. Okay, so first, let's go ahead, and I have Aries on the ascendant. Let's take a look at where this Mars opposition to Pluto is taking place. If you're an Aries rising, we're looking at Mars in the 4th house of family, but also of parents, and also of that general sense of inner support, which can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. Sometimes that feeling of inner support comes from our family or the home that we live in, but it can also come from something like feeling secure in assets that you've accumulated, right? If you just, maybe it's not the home itself that is the important thing that makes you feel secure, but what are the things that make you feel secure, whether they're emotional, whether they're material, whether they're familial. The 4th house ties in all of those things. So one thing that is being suggested here is that with Mars going through such a profound transformation in the 4th house, that there could be some pretty potent, intense entering of a process of change around these forms of support, whether they're family, parents, property, the place that you live, or a kind of emotional inner security or something like that. But it may be tied in with things of the 10th house, like career or something that has to do with what actions you take on a daily basis out in the world. And I think with the new moon taking place in the 8th house, it could also suggest that there is something that is bringing in contracts that we have with certain partners. And when I say contracts, it could be anything from a business partner. It could be anything from you signing, a bank loan or something like that. It could, of course, be relying on a form of support from a marriage or along those lines, or like a spouse's resources or something like that. But I think here with the big transformation with Mars in the 4th, that has to do with actions, it's bringing in those two topics. But I think the newness is coming from the 8th house that is really informing those changes around the 4th house. So I would look to a kind of emergence around things that have to do with how we contract with partners, spouses, entities, or institutions, or something along those lines that has a direct impact on what we depend on financially, or could even be kinds of support that we receive in terms of like if you are in real estate or something and you depend on referral business or something like that. But I would look to those kinds of themes or narratives coming in if you're an Aries rising. Okay, let's go ahead now, and we will place Taurus on the ascendant. And if you are a Taurus rising, the astrology is coming in through the third and ninth house. Now, what's interesting, me being a Scorpio rising, I had the same two signs being activated in my chart, but they're flipped, right? I have Mars in the ninth and Pluto in the third. And so both with Taurus and Scorpio risings, you get that axis that has to do with the mind, with the environment, with also kind of experiences that lead one to profound understanding in very deep ways. So, for instance, the ninth house is often associated with things like with higher institutions of education, universities, but it can also be related to travel and things like that. Well, this is Mars in the third if you're Taurus rising, tying in those higher experiences that bring profound understanding, maybe even a sense of spirituality or a connection with something divine. But the change is really happening in that environment, in that local place of the mind, of the emotional places that we live in. It's sort of the emotional environment around us, or the mental environment envelope that we live in. And it can have a great deal to do with the people or things in the environment that have a bearing on things like our emotional well-being or our emotional security or things like that. But it's sort of this emotional environment or mental environment the third house can bring in, especially if you have a Cancer third house. And there's something kind of going through a profound transformation that brings in both the sense of um, those higher forms of understanding, whether that's because you're in an actual ninth house place, like an institution of learning, or a church, or a foreign land. But the important thing is not really um, what is inspiring the third house transformation so much. Those forms can be different, but the third house going through those deep transformative moments that is bringing in a kind of clarity of deeper understanding is almost understated if you don't use the word profound here, I think. But I think that this really also is having to do something with the new moon forming in the seventh house, a place of partnerships or relationships. So, of course, it could be that there are environmental transformation that is due to relationships or partnerships, or things developing or emerging in partnerships or relationships. So that can be pretty profound as well. What did I have for my notes here? Um, could this have to do with big changes in the mind or environment, emotional health that is tied in with higher principles, but also things maybe like education, publishing, travel? And there is a kind of newness in relationship or partnership that is kind of emerging. So even if you're somebody that is in a um, long-term relationship, LTR, as they say, as the kids say now, um, we all go through a kind of emergence of newness within relationships, even if the relationship itself has some history to it, right? So this could all be tying in these different things if you are a Taurus rising. Okay, now let's go ahead and move the real-time clock forward. We're going to put Gemini on the ascendant. If you're a Gemini rising, Mars in your second house is forming that opposition to Pluto in your eighth house. And then we also have the new moon that informs or provides for Mars from the sixth house. So we have things emerging, a kind of newness that is taking place and informing things from the sixth house that may have a bearing on a kind of transformation around things that you cultivate. We're so quick to jump to the second house and say, okay, it's your money. Mars in the second, what's going on with your money? Are you losing your money? Is there hardships around money or meeting the bills or something like that? And that isn't inaccurate to say, but I think it's kind of narrow because the second house really at a deep level has to do with things that we cultivate. It's sort of the plot of our lives, if you will. Back in ancient times, where pretty much everybody was either like a hunter or gatherer, or or beginning to be in kind of rural agrarian communities where we pretty much all of us just farmed. This would be like our own personal garden, right? The second house. Um, and so it's what kinds of things are we continually planting and cultivating and taking care of and nurturing, those kinds of resources that we're nurturing that will eventually in time come to feed us in a certain way. So it could be material things, and it probably is connected to material things for a lot of people that are Gemini rising. And it is speaking to having that connection with the eighth house. So it could be the ways that we are tied in with our spouse's assets or resources. It could be the contracts that we have with people, whether they're contracts with the bank, whether they are contracts with an ex that is paying child support or something along those lines. Whether it may even be our position at work if we're somehow connected or responsible for the duties of the company's assets or something, or balancing the assets of the company or something like that. So it can have a myriad of things, the eighth house. Um, and with the new moon that informs all of this from the sixth house, I get the sense that it's almost speaking to a kind of emergence of um, duty, or like a like a responsibility. Like all of a sudden there is the need to sort of do work in a very particular area, or take on a challenge, maybe even become an advocate for something or a cause or something like that. But that sixth house tends to bring in that kind of um, labor or job or cause that may be emerging right now. So it could be something small, it could be something big, but I would think about how are things changing in a financial way that somehow have to do, or is at least in parallel with a kind of way in which there may be new work or labor, or a cause that is taken up or emerging right now. So I would look to that if you're a Gemini rising. Okay, now let's move the real time clock forward to put Cancer on the ascendant. So if you're Cancer rising, obviously this is quite a existential transit, because we have Mars in the first house, a place that is said to be the place where the chart represents our body, our soul, our spirit, our health, our personality, our identity, a lot of things, but it's all very existential to us personally. Um, and then the new moon is uh, emerging new things of the fifth house that is informing all of this. So, could it be a changing sense of identity or purpose as it relates to romance, joy, creativity, relationships, or perhaps children? So, you can almost kind of merge seventh house topics with fifth house topics here, because the seventh house and fifth house kind of overlap. Both houses sometimes relate to sex. Both houses relate to romance or relationship, especially a kind of relationship that is has it is like an affair, or is just romantic and fun and enjoyable, entertaining. It almost like the more enjoyable side of relationships or romance kind of comes in with the new moon being in the fifth, but Pluto being in the seventh, and how there is something to do with partners or spouses or relationships from the seventh. But there is also a kind of emergence in the fifth house that may have to do with joy or romance or creativity. So all of this is bearing down on um, that sense of uh, personhood or self. And this can range anything from health, like Mars in the first, having to do with how do we take care of ourselves, and how does that somehow bring a kind of a transformation, but also balance and a restorative kind of um, thing with people that we are relating to, or people that we have romance with, or um, things that have to do with other people and ourselves. So like you get almost like a mirror kind of thing where I see myself in others, or or my spouse is really into this, and so I'm sort of going along with that, and I'm changing because I'm with this other person because we do this thing together, and it brings fun, or it's about kids, or it's a creative thing that we do. But how those two areas sort of reflect back to the first house and bring pretty existential changes around identity, health, um, even like emotional well-being or something like that. So all of those topics can come in. All right, now let's go ahead and we'll move the real-time clock forward to put um, Leo on the ascendant. If you're a Leo rising, Mars is making that opposition from the 12th house in Cancer, and it's opposing Pluto back in the 6th house. So we have this falling across the 12th and 6th houses. But the new moon is coming through and informing this opposition from the 4th house. So if you are a Leo rising, I wonder about recovery or recapturing yourself in some way as it relates to mental, emotional health, physical health. Um, that may tie in with new beginnings around forms of support or family or home. That new moon in the 4th house that is informing Mars in the 12th, it sort of says, um, you know, what forms of support that are beginning to present themselves, whether it's a new physical location that you're setting up home, whether it's somebody new in the family. It is somehow speaking to how do we come back to ourselves? How do we go through forms of recovery or recapturing ourselves? Because there's always drift, right? There's always this kind of we are who we are, and we're centered in that, and then we sort of drift and move away from that, and we there can be times where we live in the shadows, and it doesn't have to be like, I'm not saying that it's bad or negative necessarily, but it's just somehow or another we're in a kind of ambivalent place. We don't always remain completely centered in ourselves. The 12th house has that quality. So this can be about health. It can be about also kind of hardships or challenges. But the 12th house is a place of shadows. And it's also a place that is always trying to get back to the first house of self. So it's kind of a, how do we recapture ourselves? How do we understand the shadows that brings light to who we are and things like that? And make adjustments in emotional health, physical health, um, you know, the people that we surround ourselves with. And how does all of that relate to the kind of support or forms of support that we may feel are beginning to emerge? Whether that is the money in the bank account that makes you feel like, yeah, I'm fine, I'm okay, right? Or whether that is family relationships that make you feel like you have people, or whether that's the place that you live, or whether that's the like your ethnic cultural heritage that makes you feel like you're part of a people, or any of those things can be kind of the thing that forms a feeling of support. And so I feel like all of these things are somehow interrelated or parallel to each other. Recapturing or recovery is a kind of theme, and it may have to do with emotional support, physical health, things like that, I would say, if you're a Leo rising. Okay, now let's go ahead and move the real-time clock forward, and we'll put Virgo on the ascendant. And if you're a Virgo rising, we see that Mars is making that opposition to Pluto from the 11th house to the 5th house. And then we have the new moon that is coming through. Remember, the moon, the host of Mars, and is informing all of these Marsy 11th house things as it perfects to Pluto over in the 5th. So you get the sense that um, there could be dynamic transformation or change around things that are social in nature, social networks or groups of friends or something like that. And this may tie in with anything from um, uh, the pleasure or the that side of life that we meet and enjoy friends with, and we do things with, we do activities, or we socialize with people, and we're somehow engaged or entertained or having fun with people in our social sphere. And the new emergence of things coming from the third house suggests that it's almost like, are we in a new environment, or is something, are we in a kind of um, is somehow the environment emerging in a new way that we enjoy different groups of people or something along those lines. Now, it could also, of course, have to do with children somehow, but I think the emphasis here is sort of the transformation or changes around things like social circumstances or situations, or perhaps even aspirations or goals for the future that may be changing in relationship to kind of newness emerging in some kind of environment. Sometimes that's sometimes that's an emotional environment, like just in ourselves. Sometimes that environment is the way that we think inside of ourselves or something like that. But of course, this can be like you move to a new area and now you have new friends, or something like that, or you change jobs and now you're around a different group of people or something like that. But I would look to those things and um, see the dynamic transformation around the social sphere of life, or the goals and aspirational sphere of life, and how that is relating to newness in some way in the environment around yourself in an everyday sense. Okay, let's go ahead now, and we're going to put Libra on the ascendant. If you are a Libra rising, we have Mars in the 10th house, making that opposition to Pluto in the 4th house. So this aspect falling across the 10th and 4th houses. And then we have the new moon that is informing this aspect, the moon being the host of Mars in the 10th, in the 2nd house. So, with Mars in the 10th, let me just pull up my notes. I had a very specific way that I worded this. Transformation around what you do in the world or how the world receives you. I like the sound of this, where the 10th house is always kind of narrowed down to career for most astrology interpretations. But if you think about the 10th, if you're a Libra rising and you have Cancer as your 10th house, um, the moon receives the light of the sun. So it's almost like the 10th house has this connection with how the world sees us or how we're visible. So it's kind of like, imagine like the full moon, like your full moon version, right? It's like you have that private dark moon version of yourself that's maybe like the 4th house. And then you have that sort of, I'm a full moon. This is how I'm most visible. That's the 10th house. That's how we are most visible to the world. And oftentimes that's because it's the way that we do things in the world, or our daily activity. And that's where you get all of the interpretations of like career, right? Because we go to the career every day, or we engage in action and involve ourselves in the workings of the world. So it's those kinds of ways that we are visible in the world. And I think that with Mars in the 10th, it's could have to do with how the world reflects us, or how we are reflected in the world. How does the world receive us? How are those things going through some pretty potent and powerful changes or transformations that may tie in with family or living situations, or the home, or things like that, that are bringing attention to what we are doing in the world and how the world receives us. But it's a kind of transformation perhaps around rank, or achievement, or um, profession, all of those kind of worldly places that may have to do with our status or reputation, as the world reflects us and we reflect the world. And then somehow it's being all informed by the things that we've cultivated with the new moon in the 2nd house. Have we invested properly in things? Have we saved money? Have we spent too much money? Are we just dealing with a new way of approaching finances or a new financial circumstance that we have to sort of make changes with. So, for instance, let's say that you're a Libra rising and things are shifting in the job, and this means that there's sort of a new way that you invest in finances or resources or your bank account or something like that. It's tying in those things that is sort of bringing about or informing the way that you're showing up in the world, I think. So if you are a Libra rising, those are the areas that seem to be really profound right now for you. And let me know in the comments if that is hitting the mark, or maybe examples that make sense if you see those two topics coming in. Okay, let's go ahead now and we'll move the real-time clock forward, and we're going to put Scorpio on the ascendant. So this is a lot like Taurus. This brings us back to the Mars-Pluto opposition falling across the ninth and third houses, but this is flipped from Taurus, where now Mars is in the ninth house, that place of higher philosophy and wisdom, the place that was called God by ancient astrologers. And so there is definitely deep transformation around. It's almost like a divine understanding, or kind of like a higher wisdom or a development around um, uh, how we understand ourselves. And this is existential. This is a lot like if you're a Cancer rising, because Mars is your ascendant ruler. So there's something very existentially transforming around the self. We're also having the new moon happen in the first house. So this one is pretty easy, I think, to understand, but it's somehow tying in with these kind of experiences that bring about a kind of massive, almost like um, deep philosophical understanding about who you are, what you are, your nature is somehow, I think, coming into like a clarity, and there's just profound understanding around this. Now, this may come with the kind of understanding that there are real changes that need to happen. And maybe there is a kind of education that needs to happen or something like that, or there's a need to change the way you think about things, the way you emotionally relate to things or people or situations, um, in order to be a person that you know you should be, or something like that. But there's a newness around the self somehow. This could also have to do with something health related, of course. And myself personally, being a Scorpio rising, I know that these health topics have been really weighing pretty heavy on my mind. It's everything from, there's been this real need to want to learn certain things. And a lot of it has been like, for example, like I've really been getting into listening to RFK talk about the health crisis in the country, and how it's like we went from realizing that we have to be really careful in our household around the kind of wheat or corn or the kind of products that have this glyphosate chemical, this Roundup chemical that is dousing the food. And so it's been a big transformation in terms of, well, how do I be healthy? And there's a higher understanding that's sort of coming in, and it's not easy. It's definitely like stressful, and it's tense, and it's kind of carries along this weight of like, I need to change something, and it's not going to be easy kind of thing. So difficult, but also very transformative for me personally. But this Mars-Pluto opposition really, I think, across the third and the ninth is really speaking to a kind of transformation around the mind, emotional, mental, environmental, educational kinds of places that sort of bring about new wisdom and knowledge. Okay, so if you're Scorpio rising, I think it's somewhere in there. All right, let's go ahead and roll the real-time clock forward. And we're going to put Sagittarius on the ascendant. If you're a Sagittarius rising, Mars is in your 8th house, and it's forming that opposition and perfecting it across to the 2nd house with Pluto there. But now this is being informed with the new moon that is coming through in the 12th house. So this is really, really interesting. As maybe there is some positive development in relationship or partnerships that may also bring in new shadow sides that you begin to understand. Yeah, that was just a note that I wrote to myself. But I don't have this in the chart showing up right now. But one thing, maybe I should just put it in. Let's see if I can put it in real quick. We got Venus and Jupiter. All right, there we go. One thing that's really interesting if you are a Sag rising, you got Venus in the 1st house making an opposition to Jupiter. This aspect perfects as the Mars-Pluto aspect is building to perfection, and then the new moon in the 12th house. So one thing that's really interesting is it strikes me, if you're Sag rising, as there are good things happening in the sphere of relationships or partnership. It may be that your partner is getting some wind behind them in their career or something like that. But there is this interesting way in which we have Mars in the 8th that may be bringing in very potent and powerful changes around the topics of shared resources or assets or something like that. And then we have the new moon that forms in the 12th house, a place of shadows. So it almost strikes me as like there's good things that are happening somehow relationally, but there are shadows that come along with it. And I don't mean to say that like your partner is going behind your back or something like that, but it could be something like imagine you're standing in the sun and then you turn, or the sun I don't know, changes in the sky, and a few hours later you notice that the shadow changes. So it's kind of like um, the light is illuminating something across the 1st and the 7th house that is bringing about something positive, and that changes the orientation towards something. But with the new turn of orientation, there's kind of like a new shadow, and that newness of the new moon in the 12th suggests that it's like as the sun makes a new shadow and falls or hits you, and then that shadow falls in a different way. It's almost like there's kind of like an investigation around the newness around things that are shadowy. So it's like okay, before I used to watch out for these things that would trip me up in the shadows. Like I know this about the situation, you got to watch out for this, be careful about that, you know. And it's like there's something new that's coming in that says, well, there's a shifting in the shadow, and you sort of have to get familiar with that a little bit so that you know where are the new things that are hidden, and you need to sort of become aware of them or something like that. And it might have to do with those financial realms, even though there may potentially be good things that are happening with the joint resources or the spouse's career or what have you. But it's as if relations are good, finances are tricky, and the transformation around those things brings in a new orientation, and you sort of meant to try to begin to understand where are the new pitfalls or shadows or things that trip you up or something like that. Hopefully that's a good interpretation if you're a Sagittarius rising, but I just thought that was really interesting when I looked at Venus and Jupiter falling across the 1st and 7th house axis there. All right, I'm going to take that back out. And let's roll the real-time clock forward to put Capricorn on the ascendant. If you're a Capricorn rising, we have Mars in the 7th, making that opposition to Pluto in the 1st. And then we have the new moon taking place in the 11th house, which the moon being the host or dispositor of Mars in the 7th. So this is really interesting because we are potentially looking at shifts in partner or relationship with Mars there in the 7th house. Now Mars also going to be doing its stuff, working its transformation in the seventh, and then moving into the eighth, the place that has to do with like shared resources. So that's kind of an interesting thing there as well. But it's that powerful shift or transformation that's happening in a partner's life or in relationship or in partnerships that we hold that are somehow tied in with the emergence of social circumstances. We get something new in the social sphere of the 11th house, whether that is new aspirations that bring us into contact with new networks of people or friends or groups or allies or mentors or something like that, or whether that's kind of like a change in uh, the person, the intimate people that we're with that bring along a kind of newness in the larger social sphere of people that we hang out with, or something like that. But I would look for those very potent and powerful changes um, around relationships, partnerships, um, maybe even sex or romance that has to do with something new around new people, new friends, new associations or groups that we belong to. So, for instance, this comes along whenever anybody gets into a new relationship or gets out of a relationship with somebody where uh, there's always newness in, like, well, if I'm getting out of a relationship, well, now I don't, unfortunately hang out with these people anymore because that's connected to that world. And I'm meeting new people over here. Or if it's getting into a new relationship, um, maybe your partner is leaving a job or something like that, and they start a new job, and now you're with different people because they're with different people or things like that. But I would look for the tie-in between those two areas of life where there's a big social dynamic. I guess at the very least for Capricorn risings, it feels like both the 7th and the 11th house are very social, and it feels like there's just massive transformation around that social sphere that may be professionally related. It may be work or career related, with the 7th being partners and the 11th being sort of the aspirations for professional life. But it could also just be purely platonic or romantic or something like that that has nothing to do with the professional sphere. But definitely, I think both of those houses being incredibly social places that describe social circumstances and environments, I would look for big transformation around that sphere of life if I was a Capricorn rising. Okay, let's go ahead now and we'll move the chart and put Aquarius on the ascendant. If you're an Aquarius rising, we have Mars in the 6th house making an opposition to Pluto in the 12th house. We also have the new moon that is forming in the 10th house that is going to be um, informing Mars as Mars perfects this opposition to Pluto. So we're bringing in these houses that are more difficult houses when you have Mars in the 6th. Now, Mars was said to have its joy in the 6th. This can be anything from taking on becoming like an advocate, or like championing a kind of cause that you take up with Mars in the 6th thing. I'm going to champion for this. I'm going to protect that. I'm going to be an advocate or fight for this or that. And with the new moon in the 10th, bringing in a kind of newness around how the world sees you, or what your rank or reputation or career or professional actions are, having a new job, being in around a new around groups that have a cause, or are engaged in doing something for a reason. Um, it strikes me as kind of transformation around these areas. If you're an Aquarius rising, it's like, how is it that you may be taking up causes, or what kind of work are you doing right now that is big? It has a lot of transformation around it. It maybe changes reputation or rank or achievement that you're engaged with. Now, the other thing, though, is that this, of course, with the 6th and the 12th house, it can also have to do with forms of either misfortune, hardship, challenges, sometimes health things that come up. And so this can sometimes pull in the 10th house, like everyday action that I take, like for instance, every day I do this practice for myself because I need to mitigate these particular healthy things that keep me in health or something like that. So w- what are the actions that we take that mitigate misfortunes or hardships or challenges? Those, so this can, if you're an Aquarius rising, this can sort of speak to kind of that I need to take action to mitigate, um, or at the maybe mitigate in some cases, or in other cases, just simply execute, like do the work, do the hard labor, just stay on task, something like that. So could be health, could be just trying to stay on task, but there's a sense in which there are kind of challenges that need to be met in a daily way. There's daily action that is really important. And it may be that you're sort of moving into a new, um, there's an emergence of new actions that sort of help all of that, or are related to all of that in some way. Okay, let's go ahead and put Pisces on the ascendant. If you are a Pisces rising, we are looking at Mars in the fifth house, making that opposition and perfecting to Pluto in the 11th this week. And this is a pretty sensitive place. There are a number of reasons why. This one for me really was one of the more interesting rising sign delineations to think about, because let's just think about Pisces rising, a Jupiter ruled sign, very empathetic, a sign that is concerned with the empathy of people around them and the importance of um, enjoying life. Pisces rising is very concerned with art, creativity, music, but also the cohesion of people and groups, and social cohesion and things like that. So with Mars and Pluto hanging out across this very social 11th house, um, in attention with things that are happening in this very creative house. And then you have, if you're Pisces rising, you have on top of all of this sensitivity, you have a very sensitive fifth house naturally, because it's the moon's sign there in Cancer. So that place where we have children in the chart, that place that is very creative, it's very sensitive, emotional, mothering or nurturing place where Mars is in, kind of irritating those dimensions of life, or bringing in tensions or stress in that area of life. And so there's kind of this social, creative enjoyment sphere of life that is kind of in attention. And then what makes this one really interesting is that you have the new moon that forms in the ninth house in Scorpio that is hosting that Mars. So this is, I feel like that new moon is saying there's an emergence of very, of higher understanding, of higher wisdom, of higher emotional intensity that is somehow informing the kind of, um, the difficulty surrounding that very sensitive place of children, or that very sensitive place of creativity, or that very sensitive place of the importance and the need for enjoyment or fun. And it may have to do with topics of other people in terms of social scenarios, like groups, communities, friends, things like that. But that, it's hard to put into words, because it feels like it's very specific to you, and it's so emotional and profound with the new moon in ninth there, that it's hard to really say exactly what it is, but it feels like it's kind of deeper than words, and it's a kind of transformation that brings in a very uh, major understanding, or it catapults you into kind of like a kind of understanding that you hadn't had before. It's like it's like traveling to a new land, and all of a sudden your eyes just open, and it's like, oh my gosh. Like for example, the first time that I traveled to Thailand, it was my It was the furthest place that I'd ever been to. I'd been to Europe. I've been to Mexico and Canada and places like this, and Hawaii, of course. But when I went to Thailand and I saw for the first time the temples, and it was the first time in my life that I hadn't seen churches. The religious, um, the forms of religious architecture were not Christian in nature, right? They were, for the first time in my life, they were these Buddhist temples, and I'd never seen that. That had a profound change in how I understood things, how I understood life. Um, and it's almost as if this kind of profound emergence in how you understand something, it's impacting the way that you're creative, or the way you relate or nurture children, or are involved in communities that have to do with children, or something along those lines. But it's like a social recreational space that are tied in with somehow with new philosophies, maybe spiritualities, higher studies, something that's really profound and deep, that's emerging right now, coming into view and informing the kind of um, powerful transformation that is probably not easy, probably comes with its own kind of agony almost in a certain way. Um, but nonetheless, I think can lead to something lasting and hopeful and optimistic down the road. But that kind of metamorphosis out of the one creative version of yourself, or nurturing version of yourself that relates to what makes you happy, it sort of has to happen, so that down the road there can be like a more solid or stable kind of iteration of how you relate to things that provide joy, fun, recreation, nurturance towards your creative endeavors, or your children, or something along those lines. And then this can be social in nature, because there's Pluto in the 11th house too, bringing powerful transformation around groups, or friendships, or something like that. So that is what I have if you are a Pisces rising. Thanks everybody for watching. Hope you guys got something good out of this. Please leave me some comments in the comment section, and I'll be back next week with another Mantic Monday episode. Bye for now.